One of Van Gogh's works that clearly shows his post-impressionist style is The Night Café. It dates from 1888. This is based upon an actual experience of Van Gogh. He went and stayed in this hotel that was above the cafe for 3 nights in a row. He slept upstairs, but in the night he would come down and observe those who were in the cafe. These were people who didn't have money for lodging, but they came here then and would drink all night. And that's definitely suggested here. If you look at the clock on the wall, you can see the late hour. If you see the glasses on the tables that have all been left behind, that too suggests that this was once bustling and busy, and now it's been left behind in the small hours of the night. If we look here at this detail, we can see some of the elements that are clear representations of post-impressionist kinds of concerns. First of all, let's look here at those pulsating light fixtures. The short, choppy brushstrokes there, very much reminding us of an impressionist brushstroke. And what we see with Van Gogh is that he leaves behind a 3-dimensional buildup of paint on the canvas, and that's called impasto. Impressionists did that too, and so we can see that this post-impressionist approach, Van Gogh is picking up on some of those impressionist elements and leaving some of them behind. Now, we've got this arrow here pointing at the vase of flowers to show the impasto, but you can see it throughout the canvas. Van Gogh is really known for his impasto. In fact, his layers of paint are so thickly built up on his canvases that conservators are having a hard time keeping that heavy layer of paint from just falling off in huge chunks. So let's look at this main image again and talk about some of the other elements that are post-impressionist. One of the things that we had, and we saw this very clearly in the works of Degas in the Impressionist movement, is a Japanese influence. Remember, this is called Japanisme. And it's most clearly shown here in Van Gogh's works with an attention to some negative space. You can see this part of the wood flooring is very empty and it takes up a lot of space in the painting. And there's also a tilted perspective. So instead of perspective seeming really believable, as though it's going to recede off into 3-dimensional space, it seems too steep. And that actually makes it feel like the pool table is going to kind of slide out toward us. But those tilted perspectives were part of the Japanese aesthetic that was so influential in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Another thing that we have that's post-impressionist is these heavy outlines. Now, this is something that separates it from Impressionism before. Remember, many post-impressionist artists felt like Impressionism had become too formless, that there wasn't enough delineation and sense of objects that was retained in the Impressionist approach. So many post-impressionists, to return a sense of form to their works, begin to use heavy outlines. And you can see that in Van Gogh's work throughout the canvas. Another element that sets post-impressionism apart from impressionism is what we would call the sense of fin de siècle. So as we said in the introduction, fin de siècle is this term that kind of encompasses the anxiety of the years leading up to the close of the century. Society had changed in incredible ways over the course of the century, and it made people just kind of fear what was to come next. They were unsure of what would be headed their way in the years to come. It made them feel anxious, it made them feel uneasy, it made them feel despair, and all of those emotions are so clearly shown here in Van Gogh's work. And it's really one way that post-impressionism separates itself from impressionism, because instead of the impressionist focus on the atmospheric effects of light and color, what we're doing here is we're manipulating those effects. And what we want to do by manipulating those is create a really strong emotional content. And the emotional content here relates to fin de siècle. That strong emotional content, especially as it regards to fin de siècle, is a clear key characteristic of post-impressionism. So when we look here, it's very avant-garde in this approach. It's very anti-academic, focusing on emotion so much that you leave behind realism and illusion. That is an avant-garde thing to be doing, and that's what Van Gogh does here. It's part of post-impressionism. A few things that he does to create this really highly charged scene. One of the things is his use of color and brushstroke. So those light fixtures there that we zoomed in on before to kind of show the Impressionist brushstroke, they are incredibly eerie. I look at these and I feel like I'm looking at alien eyeballs pulsating out at me, and I think it's a little bit terrifying. Those are perhaps the scariest light fixtures to ever be painted in the whole history of art. So that contributes to that sense of uneasiness that we feel when we look at the work. The colors also contribute to that. And when Van Gogh wrote to his brother of this work, he described how the reds and the greens did battle on the walls, how the walls were blood red. Those were the words he used, blood red and battle. And he felt very much that this would portray then, quote, the oppressive atmosphere, close quote, and, quote, the terrible passions, close quote, of this cafe. Another thing other than the color that contributes to that sense of anxiety as we look at the work is the tilted perspective. As we said before, it feels like things should be sliding out toward you. You see that big, heavy pool table, and you think about that subconsciously even crushing you and squishing you as it falls out of the canvas and into your space. So when we look at this work by Van Gogh, it not only shows then this post-impressionist approach, but it shows a few things that Van Gogh was really known for doing. Not only his impasto brushstroke, but his use of color. And one thing we should point out is that color is something that we would call arbitrary. The colors here really aren't what we would expect to see in the natural world, and they clash and are sometimes discordant. So if we look at the clothing of the proprietor there, and we don't even see his legs, which is another thing that makes this seem a little bit awkward. That's kind of a bright lemon yellow, and that clashes a little bit with the olive green on the pool table, and that clashes a little bit with that kind of neon green of the bar behind the table. So all of these colors that are not what we expect colors to be in the world around them, those are arbitrary. Those add to the sense of the emotional impact of the work. Those too are avant-garde and anti-academic. It's a really strongly emotive painting, one that I'm drawn to and interested in, but one that I would never want to hang on the walls in my home.